Welcome to WMRE's Common Area Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the award-winning editorial staff at WMRE. Let's jump right into this week's podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Common Area with your host, David Bodamer. David, how are you?
I am doing well. I'm hot and tired. I think I've used the podcast to provide some updates on my living situation the last couple times, but I did find a new apartment and I'm in the middle of moving. So if I sound a little tired, it is because of that.
Yes. If anybody wants to help David move, I'm sure he can put your hands to use, moving boxes and things like that. Just email him and ask him. Just kidding, David. I'm not going to have your inbox full of people trying to help you move. You have a guest on the show today. Who'd you bring on?
We have with us Julie Whelan, who's the global head of occupier thought leadership with Cbre. Hi, Julie. How are you?
Hi, David. Great. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I am not moving, nor would I want to be moving in the middle of summer. So
well, you're lucky. Thank you. So before we jump into here, what we're talking about, if you want to just take a second to tell, I gave your title and whatnot, but if you want to just take a second to talk about what you do and some of the highlights of your work at Cbre, that would be great.
Sure. So as you said, I'm the global head of occupier thought leadership at Cbre. And some people sit and scratch their heads and think, well, what is that? And I did too when I first took the job 7 years ago. And really what I do every day is try to make sure that I understand what is making tenants drive their behaviors. You know, what are the things that are changing in the marketplace and in society and in the way that we work that is causing tenant behavior to be different than it was in the past. And that is not something that we can do by looking at, real estate fundamentals and driving conclusions off of that. We have to really pay attention by talking to our clients and by surveying our clients and by understanding how they're operating. And we have successfully done that. And I would say that over the last couple of years, that job has been ever more important as all the trends that we're seeing have accelerated. And trying to predict what is around the corner has become more important than ever.
Yeah, so that's a great transition to what I wanted to pick your brain on here, which is obviously ever since early 2020, the question about what is the future of office has been hanging over commercial real estate. And it seems like the answer has changed, or, there's been a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of speculation. There's been a lot of experimentation. But you've had the opportunity to do some of this hard research and talk to, like you said, your clients and the occupiers and get a real handle on where we're at. So that's what I kind of, wanted to talk about is just, so here we are, July 2022. For a lot of us, we're 2.5 years into either working full or part-time remotely. Corporations are, still trying to figure out their occupation their strategies around office leasing. So what are some of the main highlights of the most recent findings that you've had in this area?
Sure. So as I said, our efforts really ramped up across the pandemic, and we've done 4 occupier sentiment surveys throughout the last 2.5 years, with the last one being in the spring of 2022. And we did them across the world, but I am most intimately involved with our one in the United States, which I can talk most freely about. And I would say that what we are finding is just how similar employee and employer sentiment is since the beginning of the pandemic around the future of work. And what I mean by that is that we know the future of work is going to be different than it was before the pandemic. And I think a lot of people at the beginning thought that it was going to be super different, and then maybe came back on their thoughts a little bit and thought, no, things are going to revert back to the same. And now 2.5 years in, they understand that, yes, things are going to be different. And what we're seeing today is that the return to office is quite slow at the moment. I would say that considering the rest of life around restaurants and airline travel and general living life is kind of back to normal, unfortunately, return to office is not. And that's not surprising based on the results that we have seen in our survey, where a lot of companies told us, yes, our offices are open. We are welcoming people back. However, they are not really requiring a return yet. There are, of course, a lot of companies that we hear about in the headlines that are, but the vast majority of them are actually still allowing employees to make decisions based on their own discretion. And I think that's where the challenge lies right now, is that you don't have employees that are arriving at a conclusion to come into the office on a regular basis on their own. And then you have employers that are not necessarily pushing that agenda for fear of making their employee unhappy and of losing that employee in such a tight labor market. And so that is, I think, where we're at right now, is this idea that organizations do want their employees to come back on a little bit more of a regular basis than they're seeing today. However, employees are not sure exactly how to do that or if that works for them.
And does that vary by market in the U.S.? Is it a pretty consistent story for cities and for CBD and suburban offices? Is it consistent is it the same in New York as, as markets in Texas? Yeah,
so our survey results do not allow us to get to that level. However, we do obviously have offices all around the country, and we do pay attention to the data of physical occupancy that a lot of other people are paying attention to. And it's clear that there are absolutely differences from market to market. Your coastal cities that are your large, dense urban cities have traditionally over the pandemic and especially during this return to office period struggled to get even back to national averages, where you see other markets like Texas and Florida markets that have really come back quite quickly comparatively to the other markets. And the question really is, well, why is that? And there is a lot of different reasoning, and I don't think that there's anything that is completely conclusive based on data. But there are arguments that, commute time, which we pretty much know is the number one factor of employees not really wanting to engage with that return to office on such a regular basis, especially those that have commutes that are longer than, 30 minutes, because there's a trade-off of value and time that they have to make in that. There's other speculation of, weather in markets and just easier to get around in certain times. Other speculation around new business formation and the fact that the more new business formation that there is and the more that people need to come together because they haven't been together on a historical basis as much as maybe some of these more legacy markets are. So there's a lot of different speculation out there, but it is definitely true that some of the secondary markets, especially the ones in Texas and in Florida, have seen a quicker return to office. And I think that there are a lot of different reasons that we can point to as to why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I could just speak from a personal basis that my biggest obstacle is the commute, and just even from Brooklyn to Midtown, which doesn't sound that far. It's like 45-minute at least subway ride on a good day, and the subway often doesn't have good days, so there's delays and whatnot. So that's a concern. The other thing that what my company did was during the pandemic was slightly give up some space. So now and then also in the process, we lost all of our permanent desks. So it's a complete hot desking environment. So even when I do go in, even if I'm going to go in 2 days in a row, I have to bring all of my cords and my laptop and everything back and forth. And so and like if it's a day that I need to do a podcast, that means carrying the podcast mic and the headphones and all that stuff. And that's kind of a hassle. So it's just like, I feel like it hasn't been set, like in this, my very, very personal example, it's the commute, and also that I feel like the way my company has done it has not actually facilitated a way to come into the office multiple days a week without it being this, having to schlep a lot of stuff back and forth.
Yeah, and I think that your personal story can be played out many times. I yesterday commuted into Boston. I live in a suburb of Boston, and there's a train in my town. And I got on the train and I ran into a friend of mine. And I said, "Oh, how often do you go in?" And he said, "Oh, we go in about 1 week a month on to have these sort of team meetings, 4 days in a row, 1 week a month." And I thought, "Oh, that's really interesting." And he explain a similar situation to you, which is that there feels like there's a lot of friction for him when he goes in, because sometimes he feels that there's not even enough space for him to efficiently and productively operate in that office. And I think that idea of friction is one that companies have to understand and have to smooth out, because we talked even before the pandemic of creating frictionless experiences, pleasant experiences for employees that make them want to come into the office, that magnetize them to the office versus having us to push, people back to the office forcefully. And I think that companies now more than ever have to understand that. And some pulled the envelope back a lot. And they said during the pandemic, we don't have need for all this space. We're going to put space on the sublease market. We're going to contract. And I think in some cases that pendulum swung too far. Mm-hmm. And now they're realizing that they actually need to provide better space for their employees, which is what we're seeing in a lot of markets right now, which is this flight to quality. This idea that organizations still see the office as a very important piece of their company culture. They want to draw people back to the office, and they want to do that by providing the best spaces. Now, you also mentioned something interesting about just these podcasts and the equipment that goes with it. What we're seeing is actually some landlords even create amenity spaces in their buildings that are very tech enabled for things like very high quality Zoom rooms or tech enabled spaces where people can hold podcasts and record things like this that are becoming more popular. So I think that there's a lot of changes to the office environment that are just at the tip of the spear right now, that we are going to see in order to provide employees and employers these more frictionless experiences.
And you said that's something that you're seeing landlords doing, not even just like a tenant in their own space, but like as an amenity to an office. That's something that landlords are trying to provide.
Absolutely, because tenants are trying to be as efficient as possible with their space needs, while still providing very high quality space. And so what we're seeing in this trend towards flight to quality is a difference in what quality means. I think that 10 years ago, quality meant a really good lobby, that you wanted to bring clients into, that maybe had a nice coffee shop and a gym on the ground floor, and just generally, a high quality space. And now what we're finding is that the amenities that make a high quality space are very different. Things like tech-enabled spaces, private spaces for people to have meetings outside of their leased space. Amenity floors that might have shared meeting space or even food services in it. Lots of different things that create a much more operational journey for the landlord that owns that building. However, makes the tenants stickier that ultimately end up in that building.
And from the occupier, in terms of talking to the tenants, have you seen, even if you can't name specific examples of like company names or whatever, but just examples of companies that have been particularly creative about what they're doing to create the stickiness?
In terms of landlords or in terms of employers?
In terms of employers, like, yeah, I mean, like that's from the landlord basis, but I'm still interested also from like the occupier basis, if there are things that specific companies may be doing that's more successful than what others are doing.
I mean, I can talk about us, as Cbre, we are a real estate company, and we like to make sure that the advice that we're giving to our clients and the services that we can provide them, we actually utilize and find value in ourselves. And we, for many years now, well over a decade, have been building Workplace 360 environments, is what we call them. And they are environments that, our employees can come into and feel good in and be productive in. And they are very different from the old legacy assigned seating environments that were mostly made up of cubes and offices. I will say that every iteration that has been done over the last decade plus has gotten better and better, because the idea is that you listen to your employees, you listen to their needs, you pay attention to what works and what doesn't work, and you iterate for your next journey. And I recently was in London, where I went to one of our most recent Workplace 360 environments in London that was built out at Henrietta House. That is probably, I would argue, is the nicest environment that we have. And it was completely energizing to be in. And if I were in that market regularly, I would be magnetized to go into that office, even despite a commute. It was a healthy office environment. It had comfortable furnishings in it. It had great healthy food options. It had wellness features. It had multiple areas to sit depending on the type of work that I was doing and the type of meeting that I was holding. And it was certainly the type of environment that I foresee that a lot of organizations are going to move towards. However, it does take capital. It does take certainty of what you need around space. And it does take, in a lot of cases, a least catalyst activity so that organizations can actually justify, making a big move like that.
From a government level, like in cities like places like New York City, there's been more talk of trying to do things to revitalize CBD, like things that can be done to the neighborhood itself, not just to the building. How important is that of a factor, do you think, for some of this process? Do governments need to take a role in, or economic development agencies in revisiting CBDs to make them more desirable for people to come back to?
Absolutely. I mean, we have talked for a long time about live, work, play environments, and we are even more solid on the idea of those now post-pandemic, because people don't want to endure long commutes. They want to live in the same areas that they work in and in the same areas that provide entertainment for them. And those are areas of cities that we, even before the pandemic, saw performing better, whether they were in the urban core or even on the outskirts of the urban core. And conversely, you could have the best building in a suburban office park with absolutely nothing around it, and it's not going to perform well because it doesn't have the ecosystem around it that is really needed to make tenants happy. So I think that there is a lot of room for improvement in our cities, and especially in our older cities, that government agencies can form public-private partnerships that really help move things in the right direction, because the core is there. New York City has everything that it needs. It has the infrastructure, it has the talent, it has the arts and entertainment, it has the ground zero of all the businesses that it needs, and it will continue to thrive as a result of that. And I have no doubt that the appropriate partnerships will be put in place to continue to grow these mini neighborhoods that really appeal to a population that wants to live there and a business base that wants to, create a home base there.
Yeah, because I know that you alluded to there being a number of concerns that employees might have. But for me, it really I don't buy as much if that people are still, health and safety as much are concerned, because our restaurants in New York City are bustling. So it's people will come into the city when, to do all sorts of things, myself included, will go into Manhattan to do all sorts of things, but it's really a bit like the office. It's just it's just become unless I have to go, basically, it's just easier not to go and get everything done from home.
Right. And how long have you been with your company?
That's a complicated question, because my company's been bought and sold so many times. So it's I've been in the same job for 18 years, but my company has changed names 6 times.
Yes, but that's really important, right? Because you are embedded in your company, and you're embedded in the culture of your company, and you're embedded in the people that you've worked with throughout the years.
Right.
However, if you turn that and you look at new employees, kids coming out of college, interns that I have frequently been talking to that desire having a place to go to start to build their career in, it is a very different story for them. I am not of the belief that people want to come in 5 days a week, no matter how young or old you are. I know that flexibility is important. We wrote about that again. Sound like a broken record, but before the pandemic. However, there is still a need for people to come in, and there's a desire, especially for people at different life stages and at different tenures in their company, to have to come in also.
Yeah, I feel like that is one of the most compelling arguments for when, like, if you are going to have an ebb and flow around, but like one of the most important times where you could be making a priority for getting people into the office a lot is like if you're onboarding a person or a team, like and however long that period is, and then maybe scaling back a bit, but like just having that initial period where everyone is in the office together for a while, and you bring the new person on board, you get them incorporated into the team, you get people used to it, and then you figure out a better cadence later. But like that does seem like an important time to like make a real emphasis, or like, let's set some regularity, let's all get together, let's build that chemistry, and then maybe like figure out what our flow is after that.
It's very true. And you hit on a couple important points there. One of them is that deliberate interactions are really important. A lot of people have talked about how important the office is to have serendipitous interactions in, which means that you run into people. However, to create those serendipitous interactions, you need to have somebody in the organization that is deliberately bringing people together. And that's where management roles are more important than ever right now. And I think that some companies are missing the mark and actually not creating the training that managers need to actually have the tools to do that and to understand when and why to do that. And also, I think that this idea of things can change, which is what you just, talked about. I sometimes refer to hybrid work as ice cream, right? At the base of ice cream is milk, cream, and sugar. At the base of hybrid work is work from home, work in the office, and work in a third place. However, the magic to ice cream comes when you bring in all the good ingredients that people like. And the magic of hybrid is when you create a combination of things that works for the employers that are there. And what you might like at one stage might be different to what you like in another stage. And you have to be fluid enough to be able to change as those needs change. But what is at the core of that is a very strong manager who can help those deliberate interactions take place.
So how often, you said that you've done this occupier survey 4 times since the start of COVID, is that right?
I think we have, yes. We've done them every year since 2016. And what was interesting is that in 2019, we didn't do it. And the reason that we didn't do it is because I was so sick of getting the same answers. I was like, I know what occupiers are going to say, and I don't want to hear about it again this year. I'm going to use my efforts to do something else. And then the pandemic hit and we thought, now things are different. This is the time to do it again. And so we did a couple that first year, and then we've done one every year since. So a couple in 2020, one in 2021, and one in 2022.
And I imagine among those 4, they have not been the same, right? I mean, I imagine there's been some changes, I would guess, just because like I feel like the broader conversation around offices has not, I don't think it's been exactly the same for those 2 years. There was talk of like hub and spoke model or hybrid or like three and two. I think buzzwords that were tossed around at different times that I'm not hearing as much now.
Yeah, well, I would say that there are some things that have been incredibly similar, and that is just the desire for hybrid work, right? We would ask time and time again, do you want to be office? Do you want to be hybrid? Do you want to be remote first? And 80% plus every single survey is hybrid. So we know that that's the future. Now, what hybrid means to everybody is going to be something completely different. We will never get to that in a survey, but we know that hybrid is the way forward. The things that have changed, I would say, is number one, the amount of time that organizations want people to spend in the office. In the US, 80% plus of our respondents say that they want people to be in the office at least half the time, if not more. However, over the 4 surveys that we've given, that if not more has receded. So more and more companies are saying, we understand it's probably going to be a 50-50 split, even if we used to want them to be in more than half the time. So that's one thing that's changed. Now, interestingly, though, what else has changed is the idea of what organizations need from their real estate portfolio, from their actual physical footprint. There were a lot of times during the pandemic when we surveyed that the answer that we got back was, we're doing nothing. We're sitting back, we're kicking the can down the road. We have no idea what we have to do. So if our hand is forced, we're doing short-term renewals. That is now very different. However, there is, I think, a prevailing sentiment out there that what that means is that a lot of organizations are contracting. And that is true. There are a number of respondents that say we're pulling back on our space needs. But by the way, a lot of organizations, especially financial services and legal, were doing that before the pandemic anyway. There's also a large preponderance of respondents that are saying we're expanding. And the reason that they're expanding is because they anticipate business growth. Now, we're obviously on the precipice of change where we are in an uncertain economic environment right now, and those survey results may seem different now than they even were in the spring. However, in the spring, that is what our respondents were telling us, is that we are ready to move on our portfolio strategy. And yes, there is some contraction that comes with that. But on the other side, there is also many companies that are still in expansion mode.
Well, I've taken a good chunk of your time here. Before we wrap up, I'll just give you a chance if there's anything that I didn't ask you about from any of this research that you think would be good takeaways. Just give you a chance to address that.
I would just say that if I haven't made it clear, I think that the office is still a really important piece of company culture. However, as you have clearly laid out by your experience and as how I see every day when I talk to both employees and employers, that the type of office really matters. And so it can be difficult and it can be onerous to change office space. However, now is more important than ever to create a space that employees really want to be in order to change this paradigm that we are in right now of employees feeling friction with the office.
And where can folks go to read these studies?
If they go to Cbre.com, we have a research and insights page that has been newly unveiled over the last year that has a regular update of all of our insights and research from me and many others of my colleagues.
Perfect. All right. Well, Julie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and let me throw a bunch of questions at you.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure.
This has been fantastic. I love the content. So much to think about, and so many things have changed over the last few years, but it still seemed very, very positive. So I appreciate that. So Julie, thank you so much for being on the show. Of course, David, thank you for facilitating this and bringing her on the show. And our last thank you goes to you, listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Common Area Podcast with David Bodamer. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when David comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask you to share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this will help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at WMRE, this is Eric Johnson inviting you back in 2 weeks for all the stories that matter to you. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Common Area Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WMRE or Informa. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only.